Okay, great. All right, well, why don't we get the meeting going? The agenda was set around, and I just want to say that we talked about this as being kind of an organizational meeting with the expectation to last about an hour, as we think about how to move forward on the conversation and the recommendations that were taken from the last Planning Commission meeting. So that's the kind of framework for tonight. Any comments on the agenda, or actually, should we have a motion to approve? A motion to approve the agenda?
To approve the agenda as written.
I'm good with them. Oh, second.
Okay, great.
All right.
Any
So-
public comment for items not on the agenda? Okay.
All right.
Just want to acknowledge the correspondence, a letter from Paul and Wendy Mangiello. I hope I pronounced that, and a comment back from Annette. I would like to just make a comment that I think it's Annette's expertise and her willingness to come and answer questions and provide really factual information has been, I think, very helpful to this group, helpful as we think about what it means to have a town energy plan, what it means to think about what our town plan is and how we set it up to best represent what people are hoping for in the town. And I think that she's done it with an extraordinary amount of integrity. And so I was concerned to see a letter like that from someone who has not been on any of our calls, I don't believe. So just want to make that comment and thank Annette for her willingness to be an advisor. I want to make everyone clear that Annette attends any meetings of the Planning Commission or the Solar Siting Commission only at the invitation of the chair of the Planning Commission. And that is at her request. And so that is, just want to make that clear and hope that that can be continued.
And I might point out all voluntary and gratis, so that's greatly appreciated. And I would point out, just to reiterate what Mary said, that the you only have to look back about, I don't know, it's 3 or 4 minutes meetings worth, but in the minutes, where the minutes have an appendix that are 2 pages of detailed references, every single one of them as links to mapping resources and other town plans. That's all from Annette's compilation. So I mean, it's a huge amount of work and a huge resource, and I do think it's very helpful for us. So thank you, Annette.
The next agenda item is just feedback from the July 9 Planning Commission meeting and the plan for the upcoming work. The takeaways that we really gathered, at least for the initial phase of work, there was clearly a suggestion that we pursue a clarification in the town plan that would be akin to thinking about these projects having a site plan review type process to review them, so there's clarity about what's expected and how to assess them. And so that was one thing that we want to talk about the how to go about that, and then if there are any complications from doing that. The second is identifying priority areas for 150 kilowatt to 500 kilowatt solar projects, something that has been raised as a suggestion by the community, and I think a welcome suggestion. So think about the process by which that can be accomplished. And then talk about the process of looking at projects that are greater than 500 kilowatt. I believe our current plan is silent on any plan, and there's just no mention of citing of solar generation projects larger than 500. And I think that's silence, I believe.
Yeah, there may be something, I'd have to look at it. There may be something that says over 500 has to have a particular remediation plan that says you're going to put it back to where it started, or you have to have that for a project that big. That's the only specific I can remember.
Okay. So there's no, so I think the plan doesn't have guidance around that. And I think that there's desire to be clear. Is it something we want? And if so, where? And perhaps it's something we don't want. And if that's the case, let's be clear about that. So that's kind of where we are right now about the kind of upcoming work. And I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that's the only work we're going to be doing, but that is the kind of the priority work that I took away. And Ernie and Jan, any comments, additions, et cetera, to that?
Well, I was just wondering, because there were kind of two sides to the coin in terms of the citing preferred, call it preferred and discouraged, or preferred and not, there may be prohibited. We talked the 3 tiers of prohibited, possible with mitigation, and preferred. And so when we talk about specifying the preferred priority areas, that's one thing, but we also want to be specifying the things to protect, or the areas that are exclusion areas. I mean, we've always had that sort of multi-pronged piece to it. I think some of that will come out in the site plan review piece, where you say, okay, how do you review these projects? Oh, you look at these criteria, and a lot of what those criteria are the things you want to check because you're concerned and you want to balance them, or you want to protect them. Is it, forest blocks, steep slopes, ridge lines, and so forth. So the protection criteria is a little bit blended with the site plan review, but there may be language in the plan that, or even mapping in the plan, that is both preferred and prohibited.
Ernie, any comments?
Not, well, I'm trying to think beyond just, the site designations and all that sort of stuff that you've talked about, because I'm actually very concerned about also regulations that encourage, at the very least encourage, if not require, certain aspects of solar installations, or the ability to install solar in, let's say, new construction. And the other thing is, I have a question, because I don't know the answer. There are places that are sort of brownfields, which is appropriate, and I consider highways, especially medians, brownfields. Do we have anything to say about encouraging the state, or requiring the state, or whatever, to utilize spaces like that?
I don't know. I
And
did
that
do a quick mapping exercise on the federal, basically 91, and where are there places where the north and south lanes are far enough apart that there's some chunk of area in the middle. There are a couple places. They're not a lot. There's one that's maybe 8 or 10 acres or something.
Well, keep in mind that
there are a couple.
Keep in mind that things are linear, so you wouldn't have a very broad. You'd have one or two rows, going up, let's say, the spine.
Yeah, you could if you do it that way, then clearly, if you can enable it in a strip, then you can run them from 3-phase power all the way out.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, my instinct would be dealing with the feds is.
I mean, the thing I'm concerned about, and it does not mean that I'm disregarding community solar. To me, seems to actually, I'm going to call it that. I'm not quite sure what else to call it, but these, smaller solar systems where you buy into them and all that sort of stuff trouble me, actually, as a business model, not solar. I'm completely behind. But I'm troubled by them as a business model because, well, I'm right now involved in one in Massachusetts, and it's already turning out that I'm going to end up owing money to them, not receiving money. So, you know, it's because the company is just changing the ways it's doing things. It's been bought several times since the contract was first entered into by my brother, who now who's deceased, and I inherited this thing, and so on. And there are business problems with this model, and so I'm not sure of its longevity, to be honest. And I mean, keeping in mind, I've said this before in you know, planning commission meetings. Originally, the promise of solar power was that people would be able to get away from power companies, at least significantly. You know, there'd be significantly less control by the power companies over power, and it'd be a lot more particulate. Everyone would sort of control their own. And I still think that that's probably really the way to go, because I've worked for power companies, and I think they're about as trustworthy as the military-industrial complex. I mean, in fact, they're cut from the same cloth, to be quite honest. I mean, historically. So, you know, that's where I know that this is kind of going beyond, but I mean, there are ways that, you know, as Pete Seeger said, you know, if you think globally, act locally. And that's, I heard that when we were protesting SEPA. So I've held on to that because it's a really good thing. And so I'm thinking at the larger scale and how it can be brought into the town side, to the town scale. So those are my big issues.
I think, Mary, in terms of work scope, it's worth mentioning, and part of what the PC did in the meeting, I thought, was reiterate the desire to have an enhanced energy plan. That's kind of part and parcel to this whole discussion, and whether that's standalone or an appendix or done, you know, pieces of it done before or after, but that's the wrapper that goes around this exercise.
Well, I think we presented that. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, we should keep it in mind, if there are other pieces of work, scope of work things, you know, like getting the new energy data and goals from Two Rivers, because that's what has to be addressed in a new enhanced energy plan. You know, things like that. There's wording about equity relating to, you know, that was in the comments that Kyle drafted to tell us what we needed to do to have an EP. So that should be on our list. Right.
No, agreed. And I think, though, to be clear, that we presented to the Planning Commission, the first goal of the project was to develop an enhanced energy plan. And so I think there was agreement around that. And that was, you know, and that the first step was to get this piece of work done. And I think we're going to have to, at some point, decide how do we think about getting the approvals or whatever that we need, whether it's at one point or whether it's a multiplicity of times. So I do want to ask Annette, because as I did ask her advice a little bit around this concept of site plan review, if she had if there's any knowledge from her experience about any parameters or concerns, et cetera, around this kind of framework for thinking about review processes.
Can I ask a more detailed question to her? Because
please.
Please. So I went and looked at the subdivision regs and the bylaws, and I think the background was to say, okay, for solar projects, the state has said you can't use your bylaws, you use your plan, and it needs to be fairly specific regulatory language. And so the general idea in the PC meeting last time was well, we have specific regulatory language. It lives in the bylaws and the subdivision regs. And so to what degree can we pluck some of that and move it into the plan to have it serve its purpose in the document that the state allows us to look at? And when I looked at those two documents, there's clearly fodder for that. I mean, there are definitions of forest blocks. There are, very distinct purpose statements about what's trying to be protected, just lists of, it goes through scenic, ridgeline, riparian, forest blocks, erosion control. Those are all specifically laid out. So that's my question, Annette, is specifically, what are the precedents? What are the limitations of literally moving some of that wording into the plan?
So when Mary asked me about it, I said that you ought to look at the case called Rutland Renewable Energy. And while you all were talking, I pulled up the final order from the it was the Public Service Board, and then the Vermont Supreme Court's decision on it. This was a case that was fiercely fought by the town. It was by the neighbors. It was on some of the finest prime ag soil in Rutland County, and the farmers were looking for a place for an intervale type garden, and so the neighbors even offered other land, but to the developer, but it didn't happen, and so it was instead fought. And by the way, my goal is to put myself out of business. I want to. My work on this is to avoid conflict. So in looking at how to write a plan, the last thing that we want to see is people fighting against a project. We want to have the town plan speak in a way that makes it clear that people can get along. So the Public Service Board's decision, this is in 2015, contains the word zoning 39 times. And the Supreme Court decision contains the word zoning 13 times. So if you had chat, I would put the links in, but I will email you all the links. And then rather than telling you anything that is a legal interpretation, I'll encourage you to read it because it's complicated. And what happened during that time period, and I wasn't involved in it except to be aware of the dynamics, and the neighbors would call me occasionally, but they hired a lawyer and town hired a lawyer. I did go on both site visits, but the town adopted a bylaw while the project was going on, which didn't make sense to me because they have vested rights in what they apply for. But in any case, this decision that I will send you discusses how their bylaw was more like zoning, and therefore it was rejected. So
the town plan was?
No, they adopted a separate bylaw. While the project was underway, they did adopt it, and it wasn't rejected for it not being in place at the time it was applied. It was rejected for the language in it. So I will defer to you all to read it and come to your own conclusions based on what's in your zoning bylaws and see what might be able to fly. And it's a conversation. If we all read it, we could then talk about it at the next meeting. But I don't want to tell you what it says.
But so, forgive me for asking you to tell me what it says, but it sounds like what you're saying is that there was some limit on how regulatory a town plan document could be. Is that okay?
So I'm just skimming through because the standards have not been formally adopted in the plan, the department considers them analogous to zoning regulations. So that's one aspect of it. And then because the setbacks requirement found in the standards constitute de facto zoning bylaw, and because projects reviewed under section 248 are exempt from zoning bylaws, And so I confess that I
I'd
was
say.
confused at the time it came out. I'm still confused. And so it would be useful to look at it afresh. And I mean, it does go back 9 years and
Mhm.
see how applicable it is to your situation. But it's not the only place where I have had the impression, this has happened in other cases at the PUC where the idea is that it's too close to zoning. And I don't know how you thread the needle, but we know that if you put in clear standards such as a percentage of slopes, that's something that's been upheld by the Vermont Supreme Court when there is a number attached to it, but when there isn't a number, then it doesn't matter. And so you think about the kinds of specifics that you want to put in that set clear standards, setbacks, glare, clearing of forests for certain sizes. It's it's challenging, but those are the sorts of things. And you, as I have indicated, you can look at other town plans to see what they've done to get ideas. And I do have a couple of comments on some of the things Ernie was saying when you want me to comment on them.
Please.
His comments about community solar are interesting. I am aware of at least 2 instances in Vermont where the right model, supposedly community solar, went in, and then the company vanished. And I think it was the same company in both instances. And the people who bought into the panels were now in the position of actually having to replace panels that didn't work and fix the infrastructure. And I don't know whatever happened with it. I think I recall that the climate scientist Alan Betts was one of the people who was upset about it because he had invested in it. The other piece of this that I don't yet know the details of is that, along the lines of what Ernie said, my understanding is that the funding that Vermont has gotten is for community solar is to be utility developed. And so that's kind of in line with what you're saying, Ernie. And I don't know that the state has yet come up with the final details on what that is, but I think that there is some hope there.
Ernie?
I just would say that something I've observed since I was in law school and doing an internship in the legislature, and they first started talking about electric vehicles and so on, there's a lot of naivete in the state house about I'm going to just stick with alternative energy instead of just solar. I think they're more swayed by popular opinion than they are about science. And I hate to sound like Jeff Goodrich in that regard about arguing about science, but I mean, I know something about technology, and there are things that the state is requiring and doing that make no sense.
Okay. So in terms of our next step with the, again, going back to this is a planning meeting, not a meeting to solve things, is that Annette will share that that document with us. I think I would like to go back and just look at a couple of other town plans that have enhanced energy plans and just look at different ways that they have addressed those. And if anyone on this call has a plan that they are particularly find particularly helpful and want to share with the group, then please send to me and I will make sure that it gets in the packet, and I will get others in the packet so that we can get a range of kind of plans to look at to see how people think about approaching this review. Because if we can't do a kind of a zoning like site plan, I think what we need to do is figure out what are the criteria and put it into the plan in a way that would be well viewed by the Planning and Utility Commission and that would reflect the wishes of the town. So I think that would be the invitation to people on this call and others for this. And then I'll read this case, and if anyone has other cases or things they want to share with the group, again, we can have a we can have a group that's looking at all these resources. Any other comments? Yeah, Jan.
Well, I'm trying to think through the open questions that we had. And so that we can have kind of assign them as tasks, or at least list them as tasks. One of them was, with how does the new version of 5100 change the ability to pre-designate preferred sites? I've
Yep.
heard opinions both ways, but the fact that you're not going to see a plan until it's at a later date, a stage.
Right.
But certainly Chris Katuki's comments, and if you looked at them, the question was, how does 5100 constrain or change the ability to make maps of preferred site areas, or to identify very specific preferred lots, properties? So that I had on the list of questions to answer.
Yep. Thank you.
I'm going to suggest that you talk to Ann Margolis at the Department of Public Service to get clarity on what's required. My reading of the rule is that it doesn't change anything, but that Chris was referring, I think, to maybe the standards that have been changed. And so Ann is the lead person. You can easily find her email address or email her ane.margolis@vermont.gov. She's very responsive. And so you should let her know that this has come up, because I think she would be interested from a larger perspective too, and get some clarity on it.
Okay.
And just one more on that same topic, which is the question of what, when we say, okay, we get a project comes up and we're going to go through our defined sequence of review for this project. We had a very constrained conversation, say 3 years ago, around Upper Loveland, where it was like, here is the small subset that you can look at, nothing else. And then we have a list of what we could look at, scenic, ridgeline, forest, which is the regional commission's job. A&R clearly does wetlands. I mean, I'm trying to get in my head, I'd love to have just a table that said, here are the 20 things that matter, and here is who's responsible for reviewing them and deciding on them. But I'm wondering also, is there overlap? Like, we're doing forest blocks, but so is Two Rivers, clearly. So, I mean, how do you decide what the Planning Commission, in its process of reviewing a preferred site application, gets to include?
Yeah, I don't think you want to count on anyone else. Whatever you want to do in your town is what you want to look at all the issues that are relevant to your community. The state agencies are overwhelmed. A&R is overwhelmed between Act 250 and PUC reviews on the environmental side. They pick and choose. They just don't have the capacity to take on everything. And so important things can very easily get overlooked. As far as Two Rivers, they are doing what they're doing, but they also want to know what the town wants. So, and we're about to come up against I don't know if it probably hasn't come to you yet, but this idea that every town is supposed to identify a special criteria for Act 250 Tier 3, and that's going to be a town-wide mapping project. And I don't know that it's been rolled out yet, but it's coming, and I think it's coming fast. And so that's another challenge that's going to be coming to you. I think they're calling it critical resource areas. In terms of what you all want to protect or enable for development, it's up to you.
Yeah, and I think, and Linda, I see your hand, and I will call on you in one moment. I think, Jan, this concept of a rubric is something that I think has been part of our conversation since the very beginning. What are we looking at? Because clearly that's not been, that I shouldn't say clearly that's not been clear, but that has not been clear at all in the past. Linda Gray.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to bring up a context thing for you, which is that from a legislative change this year. So you all have been talking about preferred siting, and I just want to point out preferred siting is connected to net metering, and off-site net metering projects are being phased out. And that came through the Renewable Energy Standard Modernization Act. So general offsite net meter project, such as in Norwich, we've got the 4 of them. So the 500 kilowatt array that is along Route 5, there's 150 on Turnpike Road, 150 like off Bradley Hill, and there's a little 45 one near Star Lake Lane. Anyway, this year is the last year in which such projects could be permitted, and after that, there's one more year in which such projects could happen if they're connected to affordable housing. So I just want you all to know that preferred siting is connected to net metering, and net metering of the size that we have seen some in Norwich is phasing out. So I just want to raise that to you.
Ernie, thank you,
Yeah.
Linda.
I just wanted to ask Linda, what is being replaced by net metering for, the size we're discussing?
So
There
how does that
isn't-
relate, sorry, how does that relate to, say, an Upper Loveland project that is a 500 kW project, but it's net metered, but it's not community solar? So those sorts of projects would continue, or
No,
is that
that's
what
what
you're
they're getting
talking about?
rid of.
It doesn't matter who the off-taker is. Like if it's one off-taker, that is equivalent in this discussion to having a group of individual households. The replacement, there is no specific replacement. There's to be a study about that. The other thing, though, many people had noticed, like other PUC rules relating to off-site net metering, they've been making it less and less attractive. So fewer and fewer of such projects were being proposed. So anyway, so that's where it is right now.
Thank you.
That sounds significant. I mean, that
Well,
sounds,
so a little clarification, these 500 kilowatt virtual net metering projects, the utilities hate. And they, for whatever reason, came together and said, this is a deal breaker. If we don't get rid of these, then we're not going to support the renewable energy standard. However, it's still possible to do projects as long as they're built next to load. So net metering is not being phased out. It's just that it's those specific virtual ones that are not next to load or not next to the customer that are using it. The other thing that I want to make sure that you're clear of is that the preferred sites is not specifically tied to net metering. For instance, the town of Bennington has a preferred site map. And so they have had large solar arrays located in their industrial areas that are on their preferred site map. And that's kind of the goal of the preferred siting, is you want to tell the developers where to go. And that's regardless of size. So while there is this preferred site letter that is tied to net metering that you have experience with, there is the larger issue is because that's the carve out of preferred siting, right? The preferred sites were there's a list of them in net metering. They're intended to be in areas, but Bennington has a preferred site map that's on an entirely forested place. And so it's really up to the town to identify the preferred sites. So in thinking about how to compartmentalize what you're doing, I think, there's the household level, then there are these 150 to 500 kilowatt projects, if they could be built next to a customer or next to enough customers that could use them. And then these larger projects, anywhere from 2 to 20 megawatts, or, 5, we don't see a lot between 500 and 2, but we do see them. And so there's the concept of, where do you want them? Where do you want to serve your local community and site these? And then there's the concept of, the developer comes in and says, I'm doing it here and I don't care what you say. I didn't talk to you in advance. There are plenty of examples of this. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about is, I've seen it in PUC orders, encouraging developers to meet with communities first. Before you spend a lot of money, go talk to the community about the site you're considering. And now, with no more standard offer projects and with no more of these 500 kilowatt projects that are virtual, maybe there is an opportunity for that. And that's language that could be in your plan, that whether or not it's going to pass muster in terms of regulatory, it's an expression to the developers to say, we really would like to work with you, and to come to us if you're thinking about a project that isn't to meet our specific community's needs. Because the last thing that I want to see is some of these, we now have a company proposing 2 different 20 megawatt projects and a 50 megawatt project. The Panton one is getting a lot of press, and it's been in the works since 2017, but nobody knew about them until recently. And had the developers come and, met with the community, gotten input, that it could be a totally different experience if there is a benefit that could be shared. So one of the issues that Dr. Lawrence Susskind of the Harvard Law School Alternative Dispute Program, and he's the founder of Consensus Building Institute, says is that he thinks the problems with renewable energy development are that the communities aren't getting enough. And so he promotes something called mutual gains negotiations, where when a developer, especially of the big type that you're not inviting, that's not going to serve your community, it's just going to go up on the grid, he just gave a talk about this, so I'm reminded of it. He encourages the developers to do a better job of making sure that there are community benefits. And so that's just a larger topic, but it's also something that I think you could put in your plan, that you not just encourage, you got to do the shall and must, but that large scale development that is intended for serving the statewide goals and the grid, but are not serving our local needs, must come and meet with us in advance of filing their and not just the advance notice, but before they put a lot of money into it, so that we can have a conversation about how to work together and collaborate rather than fight.
Okay. Thank you. It's very, very interesting. I want to move on. Go ahead, Jan.
Well, this may be what you were going to do too, but what we were just talking about seems to emphasize the importance of the 500 kW and above topic.
Yeah, I was going to move to just thinking about how do we, are we going to, given the report that Linda gave and the net amplified, do we need to set out, kind of identify sites? And I think that has been, we've been talking about that, and whether we do it for 150 to 500 and then larger than 500 and think about that, is to just talk a little bit about a plan for doing it. Now, I would say that I think the very first meeting I attended of this group, or maybe it was the second one, we were looking at maps, and Net was walking through maps, and we were looking at kind of where are the places closest to the power sources that we want to think about having these. And so one proposal would be is to go back and at least as a starting point, identify areas that might be up for discussion for places to say these would be preferred sites. Now, I think that Annette's comments about talking with people might be helpful, because if we pick up a piece of your land and say this is preferred, I think you may want to, I think we have to think about that as a public document, but that being a first step in the process. Any comments?
When we did this for the landfill, we did a landfill siting process for the solid waste district, and we did the criteria first before applying them to a map. Because as you said, as soon as it hits a map and the map comes out, the flags go up and the press shows up and everything goes bonkers. But if you can get the criteria agreed to, or at least really transparent, you know, maximum distance to three-phase power currently in place is X number of feet, and, you know, priority forest blocks, not, you know, whatever the criteria is, get that explicitly stated and agreed to, and then the mapping becomes a mechanical exercise rather than a judgment call on specific parcels, which gets real personal real fast.
Okay, so having this be sort of more sequential then, in terms of, let's get this, I mean, we've been working on what should the criteria be, still have some disagreements, but now maybe try to frame it out more in, whether it's zoning language, talk to Ann Margolis, think about the impact of 5100 and how does that, if it does, go in to the plan, and come up with, I mean, I think the outtake can be some kind of a rubric which we could look at, and maybe that's the easy way to do it, say here's the rubric, and then figure out how you make sure it's clear in the plan. Okay. And then I think the 500 or greater than 500, I mean, I think there's a real discussion there about, you know, is there a site, more than one site, that could handle that, especially given the town plan and the town zoning's comments about, and Ernie, you spoke to this at a recent meeting, around the character of the town. And, you know, how do you balance those two? Because mega sites, I think, could raise some questions.
Like I said, mega sites are indicia of the sort of callousness, to put it nicely, of power companies.
It may be that sites that big do get site specific, you know, where you can do a mapping exercises with areas for things up to 500, but you have to look pretty hard and be pretty specific to find something that'll fit a site that big.
It might be helpful to think about acreage. So we have 120 megawatt project in Vermont, and we have another one proposed. And each of them is proposing to have 80 or one, they're both 85 acres of solar panels, and then the other land around it is 100 acres. So maybe if you think about, where would you have 100 acres that could host solar, or that a developer might come in? I mean, you are looking at your power lines, and they're really only on one part of the town. And so is there even an opportunity for that?
And just to be, sorry, and then it's 85 acres for the site, and then the 100 acres, that was that, so is the total impact 100 acres or 185?
Yeah, it's 100 acres is the limits of disturbance. And
okay, it's okay, thank you.
The specific acreage of the solar panels is 85 in both of the 20 megawatt projects.
Okay.
And then if you want to think about sort of scaling down from that, so a 10 megawatt project would be, I think, 50 acres. And we're seeing 2.2 megawatt projects that they can be done on 6 acres, but the number that seems more typical is 8 or 9. And then when you get down to 500, that number is pretty much 3 acres. And 150 is about an acre. So
Mhm.
maybe if you think about, I mean, Jan, you did work on looking at parcels and places. And so if you start to think about the acreage involved and what different parcels could host, that might be a helpful way for you to kind of map out what could be identified as preferred sites. And then it's also okay for you to have done this work and say, we have not identified that there is any site in Norwich for a X size megawatt project. Your choice, pick the number, and therefore they are strictly prohibited. You can say
Mhm.
that.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you. Um, it's interesting. If we're getting back to let's figure out what the criteria are. That's what we've been working on for the last few weeks. And so I think we can look to see whether or not there are things in the zoning that are going to be informative and that we want to pull from zoning and think about how does it overlay with what we're thinking, what the town plan says or has said or we need it to say. So why don't I take that as my homework assignment to look at that? If people have suggestions, please send them on. I'm happy to receive them. And
Yeah, I would look, I would point you right to section 3.3 of the subdivision regs.
okay.
Protection of natural, scenic, and cultural resources. It goes right through development envelopes, protection of wetlands, steep slopes, prominent knolls, ridge lines, wildlife
Okay.
habitat. It's
Great.
six pages in the subdivision regs.
So why don't I take a look at that as a homework assignment and I'll share that back. And if people have, again, we'll do it. I'll put it on, I'll get it transitioned to a Word document. I'll do track changes or actually, I don't even know that works. I'll figure out a way to do it, but I'll try to be transparent with it. And of what we're looking at. Okay. So that's a to-do. A to-do is Annette has shared the link. We'll get that posted onto the solar site webpage. People can read that. We can come back and have that as a discussion at the next meeting. And I think we decide we're going to, at least for now, pause on the looking at the maps right now until we figure out what are the kind of parameters and then apply those to a map. I don't know if there's any work to be done on thinking about these very large sites. I almost think that's not a little bit out of sequence right now. So I would propose that we pause on that for now and put that, this is iterative, and I think we'll learn a lot by looking at the regs and having that conversation in the next plan. And also, again, if people have other plans that they are looking at that they admire or think are working well, then please share them and we'll put those up on the site.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we can, in terms of the mechanism of sharing these things, we can certainly share resources using the town website. So if somebody says, oh, I really like the Sharon Town plan, people go look at it, you can put it, Pam can put it there and everybody can look at it. The group editing with track changes is where it gets messy, and it's better to just assign it to somebody to do the work between meetings, and then boom, it's a PDF in the packet and we talk about it.
Okay.
And I just found the Rutland Town solar siting standards. They're 11 pages. So that will add to your
Oh, good. Thank you.
So that's our reading assignment. I'll put that stuff in the minutes. What our reading assignments are.
Okay. Great.
I will, just on the mapping side, I mean, I agree it's premature, but I'll try and I'll put a little more time into it so that maybe a meeting or 2 meetings hence we can say, oh, if you were to look at sites that are even a prayer of being close enough to the right places, that this whole thing about close to load is very interesting, unless you're bigger than, you're out of the net metering world. then it doesn't sound like that's as important. But anyway, I'll continue a little bit of mapping investigation in the background, so that we might have something to look at in 2 or 3 meetings.
Okay. Anything else? All right,
No,
we have some minutes to approve.
I would move to approve the minutes of June 18.
And second,
All right.
Okay,
Sure.
done. Any public comment? Okay,
All
motion
right.
to adjourn.
So moved.
second.
Okay,
All right.
thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
night.
Yep.